Welcome to Untech, Plugged by Sublime Techie.
Yes.
And today we're diving deep, really deep, into securing and managing mobile devices
Okay.
and cloud environments.
Uh-huh.
So think phones, tablets, laptops, all that good stuff.
Right.
But with a special focus, I think, on Microsoft Intune
Yes.
and the whole world of security that surrounds that.
Absolutely.
You've given us a ton of material.
I have.
So our mission is to dig through all of that
Yeah.
and pull out those golden nuggets, those really key insights, so we can paint you a clear picture
Yes.
of what's important here.
Yeah. So we've got material on Intune itself, looking at privacy, how it manages policies, devices, applications.
Right.
And then sort of broadening it out, thinking about the security of mobile apps,
Okay.
on iOS and Android.
Gotcha.
And then we've even got some stuff on actually implementing Intune,
Cool.
as well as kind of wider perspectives from NIST, that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, on mobile device security. And then a white paper on securing Microsoft 365.
Awesome.
So quite a lot to get through.
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
Yes.
Our goal is to synthesize this information, pull out those key takeaways, about managing mobile devices securely.
Absolutely.
What are the best practices? What should people be thinking about?
Yes.
And how can these tools, particularly Intune,
Yeah.
but how can these tools help organizations navigate this often very complex terrain?
It is the complex terrain, yes.
We're going to look at all the layers of security
Yes.
from the actual physical device right up to the cloud.
Right up to those cloud services.
Where's the data? How's it moving around?
Yes.
And then some strategies for keeping that data safe.
Absolutely.
So let's jump right into it.
Let's do it.
Let's start with trying to understand Microsoft Intune.
Oh.
It seems to be, this central platform for managing a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. So fundamentally, Intune is a cloud-based service. So software as a service, often called SaaS.
Right, size.
And it's designed specifically to manage policies, devices, and applications all within an organization.
Okay.
It's offered by Microsoft.
Right.
And it works very closely with Azure Active Directory.
Okay.
Now, I know that's it can sound a bit jargony.
Yeah, well, okay.
But Azure AD, as it's sometimes called,
Right.
it's essentially their cloud-based service for managing identities and access.
Gotcha.
So who has access to what?
Right, okay.
So, if you think about it, you've got an employee and they've got their phone or their laptop, whatever device they're using for work.
Right.
And that device is joining your company's Azure AD.
Right, so they can get access to their email, their files.
Exactly, all that good stuff, exactly.
All the resources.
And that's where Intune steps in, because it can be set up to automatically manage that device.
Oh, so as soon as it joins Azure AD, Intune kicks in.
Pretty much, yeah, they call it auto-enrollment.
Okay.
And it makes things so much smoother.
So, less headache for IT, I'm guessing.
Oh, absolutely.
And presumably better security from the get-go as well.
Exactly. You're not waiting for someone to, manually configure the device.
Yeah.
You've got that immediate security enforcement.
Okay, so less hassle, more protection.
That's the idea.
What about the cost?
Okay.
Is this gonna break the bank?
So from the information we have, licensing costs can range from around £3.33 to about £10 per user per month.
Okay.
But obviously the exact cost will depend on what features you need.
Right.
How many users you're managing, that kind of thing.
Sure.
It's not one size fits all.
Of course.
But that gives you a ballpark idea.
Okay, that's helpful. So thinking about, cloud services and the fact that it's all, out there, data privacy and security have got to be, right at the top of the list of concerns.
Yeah, absolutely critical.
So how does Intune deal with that?
Okay, well, firstly, Intune lives within Microsoft's Azure infrastructure.
Okay.
And that benefits from really strong isolation mechanisms.
Got it.
I like to think of it like, a really big secure building.
Okay.
And within that building, you've got individual apartments, each one completely separate,
Right.
completely locked off.
Gotcha.
Your organization's Intune setup,
Yeah.
that's one of those apartments.
Okay.
Totally isolated from everyone else.
Okay.
So they call these tenants.
Right.
So the activities and the demands of one tenant don't affect any other.
Right. So everyone's got their own space.
Exactly.
They can't interfere with each other.
Precisely, yeah.
Okay, so it's like a big apartment block with really good security.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy.
What about so if you're an organization and you're using Intune,
Uh-huh.
what kind of visibility do you get into, how the Intune service itself is doing?
Okay, so in terms of visibility, Intune gives you quite a bit of information.
Okay.
It provides service usage metrics, reporting.
Right.
You can see the compliance, the health,
Mhm.
the activity of all the devices you're managing.
Gotcha.
So that includes things like startup times,
Okay.
app reliability,
Mhm.
even hardware performance.
Wow, so you can really get into the nuts and bolts.
Yeah, you can get quite granular.
Oh, cool.
And this is available through, real-time dashboards.
Okay.
So you can kind of keep an eye on things as they're happening.
Right.
But you can also generate specific reports, if you need to dig deeper into something.
Right. So if there's a particular issue,
Exactly. You can kind of go on demand.
what about the physical location of the data?
Oh, okay.
That's, always a big question.
Yes, absolutely.
Where is it all being kept?
So according to what we have here,
Uh-huh.
the main locations for storing and processing the data are in the UK.
Okay.
And importantly, organizations have control
Okay.
over where their data is located.
Right. So they can specify.
You can say, right, we want it kept here.
Gotcha.
And the data centers where all this happens,
Uh-huh.
they comply with, recognized industry standards.
Okay.
Things like CSA CCM version 3.0,
Right.
which is, from the Cloud Security Alliance.
Gotcha. Okay.
So there are those kind of assurances in place.
Right. So physical security is definitely taken seriously.
Yes, very much so.
What about digital security?
Okay.
So, how does Microsoft test Intune
Uh-huh.
for any vulnerabilities, any weaknesses?
So they do penetration testing, at least annually.
Okay.
And they call it an IT health check.
Right.
And that's performed by a check service provider,
Okay.
which is, a UK government-backed scheme.
Gotcha.
So there's that kind of, assurance there.
Right. So it's not just, an internal check.
No, it's
It's an independent,
a proper process.
the more rigorous process. Yeah.
Okay. So when the data is sitting there in Intune, is
Mhm.
it encrypted?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So data at rest, as they call it, is protected.
Okay.
And then when data is moving between systems, so in transit,
Right.
it's secured using TLS 1.2 or above.
Okay.
Which is, industry standard strong encryption.
Gotcha.
So basically scrambling the data as it moves around.
Right. So even if someone intercepted it, they couldn't make sense of it?
Exactly.
Okay, good.
On top of that, the Azure virtual networks
Yeah.
that Intune uses,
Uh-huh.
they're kept completely separate from the reseller's network.
So another layer of protection there.
Right. So it's not all just, one big network.
No, it's segmented.
That's all kind of, partitioned off.
Exactly.
Okay. And then internally within Microsoft's network,
Yes.
what are they doing to kind of keep things safe?
So within their network, they use role-based access control,
Okay.
often shortened to RBAC,
Gotcha.
and multi-factor authentication, MFA.
Right. MFA.
You've probably come across that.
Yeah.
But essentially that's to, protect access to the systems themselves.
Right. So even if someone had the right credentials,
Yes.
they'd still need that second factor.
Exactly, yeah.
Speaking of MFA, does Intune itself,
Uh-huh.
offer that for the users who are accessing,
Yes.
the managed resources?
It does,
Okay.
yeah. So it supports both two-factor authentication
Right.
and the ability to link up with existing identity providers.
Okay.
So things like Google Apps, if that's what you're using.
Gotcha.
So basically, you can kind of extend your existing security.
Right. So you don't have to start from scratch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is really helpful.
So what about keeping track of what's actually happening?
Okay.
Within Intune. So
Yeah.
are there any logs or audit trails?
Yes, there are audit logs.
Okay.
So users get regular updates on their own activity,
Okay.
on the activity of the provider,
Right.
and they can actually set how long this information is kept.
Okay.
So you've got, control over your data retention policies.
Right. So you can decide how long you need to keep those logs.
Exactly.
Okay. In terms of, kind of external validation, it sounds like Intune has quite a few security certifications.
Yes, it does.
Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, so they've got ISO/IEC 27001.
Okay.
which is, a really well-known standard for information security management.
Right.
And that was accredited by URS
Okay.
back in June 2023.
Gotcha.
I should point out that, that particular certification, it doesn't cover the initial creation of encryption keys.
Okay.
But they've also got Cyber Essentials,
Uh-huh.
Cyber Essentials Plus,
Right.
and CREST certification, which they actually achieved in January 2024.
Okay. So they're ticking all the boxes there.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
And in terms of the overall security of Intune, is that something that's taken seriously at a leadership level?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So their security governance is also certified to ISO/IEC 2701.
Right.
And there's actually a named person at the board level
Okay.
who's responsible for the security of the service.
Got it.
So it's not just, an IT issue.
It's a business issue.
It's taken seriously right at the top.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
What about the day-to-day operational security?
Right.
Things like managing changes to the system or dealing with potential vulnerabilities.
So operational security follows, certain controls that Microsoft defined.
Okay.
But they align with standards like ISO 2000
Got
for
it.
managing configurations and changes.
Right.
And NIST/ISO 27002 for vulnerability management.
Gotcha.
So they're following recognized best practice for actually monitoring what's going on.
Yeah.
They have a 247 Security Operations Center,
Okay.
SOC,
Gotcha.
and that uses a SIEM system, so Security Information and Event Management.
Right.
And that's fed by an EDR solution, so endpoint detection and response.
Okay.
It sounds complicated, but essentially they've got
systems in place.
a whole system for
Yeah.
detecting and responding to threats.
Okay, good.
And their incident management, so how they actually deal with security incidents,
Right.
that also follows their ISO 27001 certification.
So it's all very, joined up.
Yes, very much so.
Okay. What about the software development side of things?
Okay.
Are there any security considerations built into the way, Intune itself is developed?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
They say they follow secure development practices,
Okay.
which include having, independent reviews of their processes.
Got it,
So
okay.
it's not just, their own internal team.
Right. They're getting external input.
They're getting that external perspective.
Okay.
So that helps to make sure that security is, baked in
Right. From the very beginning.
from the very beginning.
Okay, cool. So let's move on to, kind of a core function of Intune,
Uh-huh.
which is managing mobile applications,
Okay.
particularly in an enterprise context.
Yeah.
Where you've got lots of devices.
Right.
How does it handle, Android apps?
Okay, so for Android, Intune works really closely with managed Google Play.
Okay.
And this gives organizations a much more controlled way of managing those apps.
Okay.
So you can automate app updates. You've got control over, how those updates are rolled out.
Right.
Whether they happen automatically on a schedule or the user initiates them.
Gotcha.
So quite a lot of flexibility there.
Okay. That level of control is really important, isn't it? For, making sure everything's secure.
Yes.
And that everyone's got the right version of the apps they need.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's essential.
What about the security of the devices themselves?
Okay.
So if a phone or a tablet has been compromised, can Intune detect that?
Yes, it can.
Okay.
So you can create device policies
Yeah.
within Intune that specifically look for jailbreaking.
Okay.
So that's on iOS
Right.
and rooting on Android.
Gotcha.
And if it detects that a device is compromised, it can actually block it from accessing company resources.
Right. So it's kind of a, belt and braces approach.
Yeah.
So it's not just managing the apps.
Right.
It's also making sure the underlying system
Yes.
is secure.
It's about that baseline of device security.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
What about internal apps?
Okay.
So, can an organization have its own kind of internal app store,
Yeah.
For custom apps?
Yeah, they can.
Okay.
So both Intune and SCCM, which stands for System Center Configuration Manager, it's another tool from Microsoft.
Gotcha.
They both offer really good mobile application management.
Okay.
So you can create private app stores
Okay.
for, apps that are developed internally.
Right.
You can manage public apps, so apps that come from the regular app stores.
Gotcha.
And you can even enforce app protection policies.
So what does that mean? What kind of policies?
So things like restricting how data is shared between apps
Okay.
or requiring authentication before you can use an app.
Right. So you've got to log in before you can even open it.
Ex-
Okay, cool. What if you've got employees using their own personal devices,
Yeah.
phones or tablets, to access company information?
Okay.
Can Intune, offer any kind of protection in that scenario?
Yes, it can.
Okay.
They have something called MAM policies, which stands for Mobile Application Management.
Right.
And these can protect organizational data within specific apps,
Okay.
even on devices that aren't fully enrolled in Intune.
Right. So the device itself isn't managed,
Exactly.
but the data within certain apps is.
That's right.
Okay, that's clever.
It's about finding that balance,
Yep.
Between security and
And for users' privacy.
and privacy, exactly.
Okay. So thinking about company-owned devices that are fully managed by Intune,
Yeah.
how does Intune ensure that they, meet the company's security standards?
Okay, so this is where device compliance policies come in.
Okay.
You can basically define a set of rules
Uh-huh.
and settings
Okay.
that a device has to meet to be considered compliant.
Gotcha.
So that could be things like requiring a minimum operating system version,
Okay.
enforcing the use of a PIN or biometric authentication,
Right.
making sure device encryption is turned on.
Gotcha.
So quite a range of things.
Right. So, all those basic security hygiene things.
Exactly, yeah.
And if a device doesn't meet those requirements, what happens then?
So that's where conditional access comes in.
Okay.
Basically, if a device isn't compliant,
Uh-huh.
you can restrict its access to company resources.
Right. So it can't connect to the network
Exactly.
or access files or
Yeah.
email.
It's locked out.
Gotcha.
Until it meets those requirements.
Okay. So it's a, way of enforcing those policies.
It is, yeah.
What about the different ways that, an Android device can be enrolled into Intune?
Okay.
I understand there's quite a few options.
Yeah, there are. So Intune supports a number of Android enterprise enrollment profiles.
Okay.
Each one's kind of suited to a different use case.
Okay.
So you've got things like the work profile.
Okay.
So that basically creates a separate area on the device.
Right.
A managed container, if you like,
Okay.
for all the work stuff.
So it keeps work and personal stuff separate.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Then you've got fully managed devices,
Right.
which are usually company owned,
Okay.
and give you more control.
Right. So you've got.
And then you've got dedicated devices, which are good for things like kiosks, where the device is only used for one thing.
Right. So it's very, very specific.
Exactly.
Okay. And what about iPhones and iPads?
Okay.
So the Apple ecosystem.
So Intune integrates with Apple's App Store
Yeah.
and Apple Business Manager.
Right.
And they also use Apple's Volume Purchase Program, VPP. And that's really useful because it lets you buy apps and then assign them directly to devices without needing individual Apple IDs.
Oh, right.
So that's great if you've got, lots of devices to manage.
You'll be a nightmare otherwise.
It would be a nightmare, yeah.
Okay.
Then there's this thing called device-driven management,
It's okay.
DDM.
DDM. All right.
And that's for, iOS, iPadOS, and macOS devices.
Okay.
And it's a more proactive way of dealing with updates.
Okay.
So instead of relying on, communication with the Intune server all the time,
Right.
DDM kind of shifts the responsibility to the device itself.
Okay.
So you get more automation, a better user experience because there are fewer disruptions.
Right. So things just happen in the background.
Exactly.
Okay.
And ultimately more reliable updates.
Okay. Cool. So let's dive into the security of the mobile apps themselves.
Okay.
We talked about Intune, which is great. But let's look at, the apps themselves.
Yeah.
Because obviously iOS and Android, they both have their own security landscapes.
They do.
Different strengths,
Yeah.
different weaknesses.
Absolutely.
So let's start with secure data storage.
Okay.
What are the kind of the best practices for iOS app development?
Right. So on iOS, apps should be using something called data protection APIs.
Okay.
And these are provided by Apple.
Right.
And they basically automatically encrypt data at rest.
Okay.
And they tie that encryption to the user's device passcode.
Right. So even if someone got hold of the device,
Exactly.
they couldn't access the data without the passcode.
That's the idea.
Okay.
Then, for really sensitive information,
Mm-hmm.
things like credentials,
Okay.
they should be using something called keychain services.
Okay.
Um, and it's really important to make sure that, sensitive data is kept within the app's secure container.
Right. So it's not just floating around anywhere.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they need to set the right file protection attributes.
Okay. So it's all very tightly controlled.
Yes, very much so.
And developers should also stop sensitive data from being automatically backed up,
Right.
to iCloud or iTunes.
Yeah. Okay.
Because, if that happens,
Uh,
the data could be exposed.
right. And end up on someone else's device.
Exactly.
Okay. What about sensitive data that's, just in memory?
Okay. So that needs to be handled really carefully as well.
Okay.
Make sure it's cleared as soon as it's not needed.
Right.
And avoid using less secure storage options.
So things like user defaults or plist files.
Yeah, those are, not ideal for sensitive information.
Okay.
And then finally, they should be using, hardware-backed security features.
Okay. Expert speaker.